everybody, this is BKC back in from the depths on my engine test platform, and today what I want to talk about is two subjects that kind of relate to each other. And the first one is we kind of touched on a little bit on the showcase of the small engine Raft, and that is motor chaining two motors together, when you should do it, why you should do it. You know, the Raft shows kind of how to do it, and what kind of ties into that is exhaust and over exhaust, and you know, kind of under exhaust and over exhaust. Under exhaust is why you would want to chain motors together, and over exhaust is kind of why it is kind of a reason why you wouldn't want to chain a motor together. And an example of it, I didn't have two motors that were similar enough to demonstrate the point, but I've been working on a new design motor right here, the cinder block I call it, because it looks like a cinder block, how they have 3 holes in them. And this motor right here is a motor that I built a while back, and the reason I built this motor is I wanted a big motor, 4,800 horsepower, that was still fuel efficient, like in the mid-range fuel efficiency. So, you know, 5,000 to 6,000 fuel efficiency is pretty efficient. I've already kind of discussed that once you get over 10,000, it starts getting stupid, and there's no point past that. So I wanted to see about how big of a motor I could build power-wise and still keep pretty good efficiency. But in building this motor, I soon realized that we're getting into a bad use case scenario, and it may not be the most efficient. Even though it's the most efficient fuel efficiency wise, it may not be the most efficient use of space. And I got an example to show you why. But first we're going to go over when to chain and when not to chain. So this motor here is a dual motor, so it'd be a 2,400 horsepower motor in a 5x7x6 space. And the reason I made it is I wanted a alternative to the Hypercube that was a little bit more efficient, and the only way to get it more efficient is to give up more space. So a 5x7x6 is more space than a 5x5x5 that the Hypercube uses, but this is way more efficient than the Hypercube. Matter of fact, I think it cuts it in half. Hypercube uses 1.9. No, it's more than half. It uses 1.9 fuel at the top end to make 2,400 horsepower, and this only would use 0.4 at the top end to make 2,400 horsepower. So it severely cuts the fuel usage in half, but is the space worth it? Now, on this particular motor, cut in half, the fuel usage isn't spectacular in the mid-range and the bottom end because we're lacking exhaust. The reason this motor runs so good is if we run it at 100% load, we see that it has 96 exhaust gas. Okay, now 96 exhaust gas does us no good as far as efficiency goes, because once we hit 30, fuel usage continues to rise, but we've peaked out at 30 on efficiency that the turbos can give. So there's no more efficiency gained, but the fuel usage continues to rise, so power per fuel numbers actually drop off of maximum efficiency number. So 96 exhaust, collecting 96 exhaust is actually doing us no good in this particular case. What it does do is at 50% load, we have more exhaust gas. We have 48 exhaust gas. So at 50% load, we are still at maximum efficiency, at 30 exhaust gas, and efficiency is, maxed out. So efficiency is probably somewhere lower, which it shows up as being 32%. And 32% is basically where the turbos get 30 exhausts. So if I go down to 32% and run it, you can see it's 30.7 exhaust gas. So all that having extra exhaust does is makes it more efficient in the mid-range to the bottom end. Now, if you have over 30 in the mid-range, it pushes it down to a lower percentage. But the argument would be that this is very similar to a supercharger versus a turbo. Lower number than 30 exhaust gases, the more the engine rises, the closer the top end, the closer the maximum efficiency is going to be at 100%. And then the more you go over, the lower it lowers the max efficiency. And so that's why you would want to chain a motor. And it shows up in my cinder block design, because the two designs are very similar, except this one has dropped that extra space, separating these two cylinders to get more exhaust out, collect more exhaust out of the cylinders. And since these cylinders only make touch one carburetor, each port only makes one exhaust. So if I was going to give up an exhaust, those would be the ones I'd want to give up. I wouldn't want to give up these up here because they see two. So the two exhausts out of this cylinder counts as 4. So I wouldn't want to give these up. So this design, I don't have a single design like this, like a cut and a half one. It really wasn't the best in the world. But the cinder block is a slightly better design. And if we compare the two, if we notice, I gotta turn this motor off. Did I not hit? I didn't hit test. I moved the slider, but I didn't hit test. Okay, in this design, we see that 5066 versus 5066 at 0.4 versus 0.8. Well, that makes sense because it's half the motor. In the mid-range, this is 6,079 at 0.4, and it goes all the way up to 6551 at 32%. And we compare that to this, and it's only 2345 at 0.5 fuel. Now, in this particular case, you could see that chaining the second, well, first of all, this one's a little more efficient to begin with because it's collecting more exhaust. This one's going to be a little less efficient because it's getting less exhaust, and at 100% we get 36 exhaust gas. So we're 6 above what we need for maximum efficiency. That's why they run exactly the same. At a 50% load, why did I keep doing? I can't do that. This is a dual crank motor, so I can't do that. I got to use the little. At a 50% load, we're only getting 18 exhaust gas, whereas this one was getting. I forgot what it was. I think it was. At a 50% load, this was getting 48 exhaust gases. So the efficiency is a lot different. But what I was able to do by collecting less exhaust, because we didn't need 96 on the top end or half of 96 on the top end, so we dropped it down a little bit to keep the maximum top end efficiency. And on the mid-range, we lost massive amounts of efficiency because we dropped down below 30% at half load. And so this motor maxes out at 84%. See, it's 53.52, which is still pretty good considering that we're using less exhaust and we're in a smaller package. And then on top of that, we have a higher density because of less space usage for making the same amount of power. So overall, this motor would be a better candidate for chaining two together versus this motor for chaining two together. This motor would be better to have the higher efficiency. By cutting these in half, the efficiency would probably move up to close to 80%, somewhere maybe a little bit lower than that, probably around 75% or so. This motor would be better to waste a little bit of space and have the higher efficiency. This motor would be better candidate for chaining together because it has less exhaust to work with, but then it's in a smaller space. So when you add the second motor, you get the benefits of the smaller space from you get the benefits of the smaller space twice, and the efficiency would go into the same place as this. Now, originally when I was building the dual version of this, because of the way it was chained together, it was pretty hard to chain to itself, and I had some problems with it, and I've since worked those out. And in this motor, this is the dual version, and it really looks like a cinder block with 3 holes and then 3 holes. But I have it set up a little bit different here, and I'll go over that in a minute. Originally, the problem I had is the chaining the exhaust loop together. It couldn't be done without going series parallel. I think it's right. Yeah, right here, these 4 exhausts right here are trapped. They can't go anywhere to get back to the parallel side. So they're running a series parallel loop, and that's 4 exhausts. And in the middle, which we can't see, there's 4 more exhausts right here that can't make back to the parallel side. So they chain in right here, series parallel. And so different parts of the motor, it's a 4-crank motor. There's a crank here, there's a crank here, and then if you look at here, there's 2 more. So it's a 4-crank motor, which this motor over here is a 4-crank motor. So they're pretty equal. They make the same power, the same cylinders, the same everything. But this motor I was having trouble with because of the way that the series parallel sides interact in the same amount of space. I couldn't get them to get that same mid-range efficiency, so I wasn't happy with the design because these 2 top turbos, I was feeding the exhaust the other direction, and these 2 top turbos were only getting 28 exhaust at 50% load, making this motor less efficient than the other design at the mid-range, and so still making this motor better for a kinetic drive versus this motor. So I couldn't consider this motor booting that motor off of the raft, and so I had to get this motor better. So I put it on the side for a little while, about a week, and then I came back to it, and within like 10 minutes of playing around with it, I solved the problem and got 30 exhausts. I think I got 34 exhausts to all turbos, and then I think some of them get even more. And let me run the motor and show you that each. Why is it not running? Oh, because of the ACBs turning it off. Let me turn this bad boy off, because for this ACB to control it, it's got a which one's turning it off? This one's turning it off. So let's put this to ACB taking damage. So this ACB can control it. Okay. So at 100% load, you can see this one's getting. Is it at 100%? No, this one's running. That's another reason that the engine raft is getting a little too complicated, because ACB control motors are starting to chain to other motors and then they mess with your load, because I got 2 big motors running, and then It affects the test results because we got different motors running and they're not running at 100%. So we get 80 exhausts out of this one, which is still, and then we got 72 in over here. We got 68 over here. I think that half of the motor gets 68, or like 3/6 of it gets, half of the motor gets 68 exhaust. 2/3 gets 72, and then 1/3 gets 80 exhaust. But that makes no difference to how the motor runs, because we still get the max efficiency at 50, 66 at 0.8. So there's nothing really we could do on a 4800 power motor that to get more fuel efficiency out of it, except for more turbos on per carb, or a supercharger per carb to get, extra 5% on top of that. There's nothing we can do to cut fuel savings anymore. And to do that, we would need to, first of all, on this cylinder, we would lose, to put another turbo on there, we'd have to lose a connection, which would mean 100 horsepower less, which would mean we need more cylinders, which would mean we even need more space, and it starts to becoming a diminishing returns issue. And so I kind of feel that I've always said that I felt that 3 turbos per carb is pretty much the best way to go, because you could have 3 turbos with 3 connections making 300 horsepower with good efficiency. And if we run the motor at 50% load, this motor will start up again, because I have to move this one further away, or move that ACB to the other side. At a 50% load, we get 34 exhaust gases to this turbo, which sees the minimum. Before it was 28, and it was just bothering me. The first 2 exhausts was only getting 28, which actually did affect the efficiency in the mid-range, and I had to get it at that 60, 79, just like the other motor, or it couldn't obsolete it. So, reconfiguring, reversing the turbo layout, replumbing in a couple of the series parallel side exhausts, I was able to do it. And now we got 34 over here. Up here we got 36, and when we come over here we got 40. So this motor is a better candidate for chaining, because it just maxes out the mid-range efficiency without over exhaust gassing it. And that's what I would say is the problem with this engine, is that we're using more space to collect more exhaust that we actually don't need in this motor. So this motor kind of obsoletes that motor now, and the only place that it wouldn't obsolete it would be at the 10% load. When we run it at 10%, of course, we only got 6.8 exhaust gas over here, 6.8 here, 7.2 here, and 8 here. So its efficiency, since I think 2 of the motors hit the same efficiency. Matter of fact, I got it written down. Its power per fuel usage on one motor is 809. The next motor is 801. So there must be 1 turbo on that second one that receives a little extra exhaust that the other motor doesn't see. Oh no, that's the last 2. The first one gets 720 power per fuel. The next one gets 750 power per fuel, meaning that one's getting more exhaust. Then the next one gets 801, and then the last motor gets 809. So when you average it out, it averages out to about a 770 power per fuel at 0.6 fuel consumption. and when we compare it to this motor, it is 1029 at 0.4. So we're using 50% more fuel usage at a 10% load. So the use case between the two motors is very, 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 very limited. It would come down to, do you have the space? And if the answer is yes, then you have to say, well, do you use that space for engine to save that little bit of efficiency on the 10%? Or do you use it for more weapons and fuel and stuff like that? Because there's a 60 block difference between this motor and that motor, which is it's a good bit. And the efficiency difference is only, it's 50% more fuel, but only at that 10% load. So would it be worth it to waste that space with the ultra efficiency over non-ultra efficiency? I would say no. I would absolutely say no. And to be honest, I would kick this motor off the raft right now, versus with the new cinder block design, because this is the reason why. For that small efficiency gauge, you have to go to yourself, you have to say, am I using a kinetic drive? Could I, in that same extra 60 blocks of space, which ends up being a 3x4x5 space, put it like a little 200 or 400 horsepower cruise motor, and have that motor run while I'm cruising, and if I could get it efficient, this motor could be off and make up the difference between the two. Now, to get this motor at 10% is 480 power. I don't think I have a 480 power motor that's going to be 60 blocks. This one's 600 horsepower in 64 blocks, but it's not super efficient. This one's more efficient, but it's lacking 80 power. So if the argument was going to be made for 420 blocks, you might be better off with the cinder block and this motor somewhere in the craft. No, not that one. Is it that one? Well, that one's 90, so not that one. Another motor, say closer in between the two efficiencies, running all the time as a general cruise motor, and use this one as a combat motor. Or if you're going to use them as a generator, meaning having them over electric, this motor makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, because you're making the same power in more space for the same top-end efficiency. In a generator motor, you only need max efficiency. So this one is slightly over exhaust for a generator motor. And to prove the point, the difference between this motor and this motor is that by 7 height. So that's one whole block of space above the motor. And to prove the point, I'm going to show you why ultra efficient motors getting that big to save that little tiny bit of efficiency kind of gets stupid. The difference between the motor is the blocks up here, which I've replaced by batteries. Okay, and what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and put the electric motor back in, because I had to disable it to make it not make my whole platform super ultra efficient and kill my test. And then I got to change this ACB back to vehicle battery. Okay, so essentially what I did is I used the space inside this motor that is wasted, and the space that we would save by using this motor over that motor. So I put batteries into space, and did I turn my drive off? Because I don't want to have that affect it. I could have just looked at my UI right there. I don't know why I went to warp myself over there. I use the space saved by this motor by putting batteries in, and batteries are pretty good armor too. If you had this facing the enemy, it would actually help save your engine a little bit from taking shots once they got through your main armor. So that's another feature. I was able to put the motor here in wasted space. I've got wasted space here, so I've put RTGs in. And the RTGs can keep the batteries charged when you're just idling or after a combat. You could just let the RTGs charge your battery instead of turning your motors on to charge your battery. And we've basically turned this into a generator. And the way you get around, the way you circumvent the fact that this is less efficient at lower RPMs is you turn the motor off. And how you automate that is, like I said, you would want to use the space for batteries and stuff like that. You would need the batteries, the motor, preferably some RTGs if you can fit them in, because that is free power. I'll talk about those in a minute. And then you need 3 ACBs to automate it, to turn it into an electric generator. The first one, you need to set up your battery percentage when you want your generators to come on. And it's real simple. In vehicle stats, you put it in the battery, and you go from 0 charge all the way up to whatever you want. And here I'm using 80% because, 80% load is pretty good. And you have to set it based on the power that you want. If you look in the UI under engine power, we have 4800 auxiliary power. And that 4800 auxiliary power is coming from the electric engine. And so we've got 4800. It's hard to see the main power because we've got all these engines adding into the pool, but we would have 4800 horsepower normal power, and we'd have 4800 electric power because of the size of the batteries. The more batteries you put on an electric engine, the more power it makes. And I wish it wasn't so, but that's from the depths mechanics. So we have equal power as backup power and equal power, as engine power. Now, as these batteries discharge, that power will go down, so you'd probably want just a little bit more. And if you needed exactly 4800 horsepower, you'd want to put more batteries in and put your set point, like make it to put enough batteries in there to where at 80% we have 4800 power, and then at 100% we have more. And then what you'd want to do is come into the battery block and turn the drive factor down. See total power available. So what we'd want to do is bring it up to, say, about 5200 power, and then turn it down to 4800 power. And what that'll do is that'll extend the time, because if you leave it over, it just makes more power that you don't need. If you don't do anything, it really doesn't do anything, but I wish they would adjust that a little bit better for more finite control on the electric side, but that's what we got to work with. And in this particular case, like I said, since we saved one layer of engine over that engine, I just did it this way. And to automate it, like I said, you'd set this to the percentage that your batteries need to be at to maintain the power that you want when you're on backup. And of course, you'd come over here and click fuel engines. You click on this boat, on this raft, since I got so many engines, I have to set the effect range. But on your craft, if you was doing, say, 2 separate generators for redundancy, you could just leave this to maximum, and it would do all of them at the same time. Set to maximum RPM, set them to 100 where they're, you know, efficient, and that will turn your generators on when your batteries get low. Now, the second ACB needs to be your charge. And the reason for that is, let's go over here to this engine block. If I set this to 100% and I set this to 100%, when I lower this and turn this off, it automatically turns the battery charge down. I wish that the devs would fix that and not make that so. I don't understand why one slider has to affect the other slider. I could have 100% charge of 0 power. That doesn't hurt anything. It doesn't. There's no cheats that I can think of that would affect that. I wish it wouldn't do that, because then it would save us having to use a third ACB. But we do have to use it. So what you do is you set this up at same thing. When vehicle battery stats go to 80%, we want to turn the fuel engine range. We want to set the battery charge to 100%. Now, on this, because of the new priority system added by the ACBs, I don't fully understand it yet, but it seems like the first placed ACB has priority over the other. And in big battles, I've had it happen before where they're both at 80%. I got 2 ACBs trying to affect, and depending on whether your CPU is chugging and all that stuff, I've had motors running and not receive charge and run down to the engine room and go, why in the hell ain't I getting charge? And it's because this ACB has triggered first, and what it's trying to do is turn this battery charge up, but since the slider here isn't up, we can't turn the slider up. So this ACB is going, okay, turn on. Well, once it's below 80%, that's in the trigger range, it doesn't re-trigger again. You know, you'd have to set up an ACB to trigger every so many seconds to do that, and then that would be another ACB. So you're just better off putting a slight delay on it. So what I normally do is I just put a 0.05 delay to make sure that when the point is reached that both ACBs are going to trigger, they're both queued up, but the first one turns the motor up and then this one queues second without messing with priorities and all that bull. And an alternative method for that, if you have a small battery pool, you could just bring that down to 79, because this one will at 80 turn on the engine, and then at 79 this one will turn on the charge, and it'll work both ways. But if you get into really large battery pools, you could have a 1% difference, could be a couple of minutes of time where the engine's running at full power and just not making any charge. So it's not a generator at that point, it becomes a kinetic drive trying to kinetically take the load off of the batteries, so you're not pulling power out of the batteries as quick. It works both ways, but I find that just putting a little 0.05 delay on it works the best. And that's to turn the motors on when the batteries get low and put the charge rate up. Now to turn it off, we don't have to worry about the charge rate. All we have to do is say at, did I change this? At battery, if vehicle's battery width is in, did I change that? I must have changed that. Let me see, did that, oh, it must have defaulted. Okay, it defaulted when I used 98% and 100. So if the batteries are within, we could use 99. It don't make a difference. If the battery's within 99 to 100%, we want to take the fuel generators and we want to set the maximum RPM to 0, which will turn down the battery charge also. So that's how we set it up. and we want to test this at a load where this motor is inefficient compared to the other motor. So we've added all the, no, this ACB is not going to do anything. We've added all this gear in the same space that that motor fits, and we want to test it at the load where this motor is inefficient over this motor. And so that is at 10% where it's making 480 power. So since 480 power is a nightmare to set up with all these propellers, I don't even think you could do it. I've set up this field generator to 480.47. I couldn't get it any different. And notice it's running smooth and clean, no glitching, no oh god dog it, I got stuck. The motor, the shield is running. That's our 480 load. The engine's not running. Okay, but you can see our battery is going down, and you can see at the bottom underneath our engine stats, you can see that we're only making 4,700 horsepower. Now we're down to 46,870, you know, and we're losing power because our electric motor is burning charge, so it has less. If you wanted to limit this to a cruise motor, like I said, you could limit this down to you know, say 800 or 1,000 power, so only you know, that's another thing that we don't really have that I wish we would eventually get with maybe an overhaul of the electric system. We can't specify what draws or what at what time. You would have to set up ACBs to turn things off, like turn ammo processors off when we're cruising, turn you know, everything that draws power off while we're cruising, and it just adds a lot to the system. I wish we could just go in through a thing and set up what would draw power when. And Steam is even worse for this. So but you can see that the shield is running fine. It's not blinking. We don't have any interruption in power. Now, can we compare this motor to that motor in efficiency now? Well, this motor's not even running, so it's infinitely efficient. It doesn't have any fuel draw. So in the same space, we've taken this, you know, at the other fuel RPM ranges, it's exactly the same, and this one uses more space to collect more exhaust for a tiny % increase in fuel. Okay, and in the same amount of space that motor takes to do that, I was able to add in a fully functioning a backup system, electric backup system, with free added power, because we have 4 RTGs in this space. Now if you do the density of an RTG, this is creating 50 power per second, and it takes up 2 blocks. So it has a density of 25. More dense than almost any motor on this platform, and fuel efficiency wise is infinite because we don't use any fuel ever to make that 50 power. Now there is a little bit of you say, well, that's infinite efficient, I'm just going to use RTGs. Well, the problem with RTGs is you need a lot of them, because 50 power, 2 of these doesn't even equal up to one of these little bitty, you know, 100 horsepower single cylinder motors. It's not that great, but you can't take this little single cylinder motor right here at 100 power and get it efficient enough to make it worth how small an RTG can go. You can't get the density high enough, and you can't get the efficiency close enough to make it worth not having to run this big 4800 horse. By getting that small single cylinder up to 770 efficiency takes a lot of space. So you're almost better using small RTGs in all the extra space around, some cubby holes in your boat that doesn't use space, because what that does is it puts fuel into your batteries and extends the time that this motor is going to be off. And since they don't provide enough power, to get enough of these to drive that 480 power to where this motor doesn't have to turn on, you would need, let's see, 480 divided by 50. That's 9.6 of these little double RTGs, and that takes up a lot of space, and these things are freaking expensive. So you don't want to put 10 of these things in to drive your motor, your 480 constant load, which would be your cruise, because 10 of these would take up more space, and they would increase your cost by a lot. But I would recommend always having one. So if you're sitting, say you're coming in for fuel by your Fortress and you're just idling, this can charge your batteries. An RTG can charge your battery when you're when the engine's not running, and it extends, for every one you add, it extends the time that this motor is off. And you notice we've been running here for a long time at 0 fuel. We're using 0 fuel. Now, these RTGs, like I said, they don't use fuel, so they're infinite fuel economy. And then there we go. The batteries hit 80%. The motor turns on. It charges the crap out of the batteries really, really quick and turns back on. So for that 3 or 4 seconds, we only used like maybe 1.5, well, it'd be like 2.4 fuel. Let's say it ran for 3 seconds. So we used 2.8 fuel, and then we're off again. So in this particular case, I see no use case for this motor over this motor, maybe other than cost, because material costs, this is expensive, just like the RTGs, and it takes a long time of operational use. This motor idling continuously all day long to provide that 480 load would be 0.4 fuel. And if you're at maximum, if you have to put that back to the refinery, and if the refinery is only making let's say 200 fuel per material, it's going to take a long time to pay you back for all these batteries, these RTGs, this electric motor, to make this motor more usable. But this motor, like I said, is less efficient on the bottom end, and it saves us space. You'd probably want to do this, and this is more survivable because if this motor gets taken out, let's say our parallel side gets a bullet in it, which would lose all efficiency. If it happens when this motor is off, who cares? We're still at 100. We're still at infinite efficiency right now because we're putting no fuel into the system right now, and our fuel and our shield has never once blinked. We've never lost power. We never had any issues. We got just consistent stream of cruising power. Never running this fuel. This motor is only going to turn on for 3 seconds every so often, which is determined by how many RTGs you put in it. So you have to do a little bit of math and calculate how much fuel savings a smaller motor that's slightly less efficient is going to give you over how much material cost that you put into your electric backup system, and calculate over, if you have the space, whether it's useful to you to have that, because it's definitely more survivable. Batteries are pretty good armor. I think they're pretty cheap, if I remember right. Let's see. Batteries. they're kind of expensive, but they're decent armor. And if this was, the deck of your boat, and that's where you're always getting your motor damage because your boat's only so high, that motor would make it worse, because once you got through the deck, you could hit right here, which is your manifold, and then you lose all efficiency. Here you have to hit your backup batteries, and then that has to drop, your pool has to drop below 80%. So you have to do a lot of balancing, but I would always say this is almost a better way to go, having a battery backup system and turn your motor into an electric generator, because while we're cruising, we just have 100% efficiency. And another thing to make this decision is your play style. If a boat has to drive out, go beat up some enemies, collect the resources and all that stuff, whether or not you're playing in centralized or localized has a factor too. If you're playing localized, you need fuel, and so more efficient motors gives you a higher operational range, carrying less fuel tanks, which means it's easier to armor them up, and we've discussed that in another video. The batteries with the RTGs, even if the RTGs, you can't run 100% on your RTGs. These are only making 200 power, but they're pumping in 200 power into the battery, extending the time that this runs, increasing the range even further, in the range where it's less efficient than that motor over there. I would always say this is a better system because it accesses the RTGs. And in a localized system, your ships can go further without using hardly any fuel. And in that particular case, I would say you'd probably even want to jump down to something. Where's that beast cut in half right here? This little 3,200 horsepower, which is half of a beast, that only gets 1,500 to 1,288 power per fuel. You could throw that in there, or say maybe the way that this one's laid out, you'd need like well, 2 hypercubes would do it. Yeah, 2 hypercubes would be the same thing. That would be a 5x5x10. It'd be even smaller than this, and you could still have more room to put more batteries, more RTGs, and so I would say even going less efficient, because they're only going to run part of the time. And see, there it goes. It kicks on, it charges for a few seconds, and then it turns off. And like I said, if we're only going to use 480 charge, we could actually lower that percentage down to 50, 40, maybe even 20%, as long as the electric engine is still providing 480 power that we need of constant load. Now, one case would be you wouldn't want to be, say, cruising along at the motor, say the motor makes 480 power at 20%. You wouldn't want to be cruising along and it being real close to 20% load, and you get attacked like right before it gets to 20%, because then the gen wouldn't kick on until all your shields are trying to boost up and all that stuff, and it would take a few seconds to charge back. And it gets a little more complicated with the ACBs to do that. You have to add in another ACB to say if an enemy is present, don't let it get below 50% load, or 80%. If an enemy's not present, let it go down to 20%. It gets more ACBs, but it can be done to where for cruising and going out to battles, you could have a zero fuel motor, and that's how my ships are kind of set up. They're zero fuel when I'm cruising, and they only use the generators when they're in combat. And like I said, that's a decision you have to make, based on your play style, whether or not you play in localized or centralized resources, and how long it's going to take for all this gear to pay you back. All this added on material cost of batteries, electric engine, and RTGs. The more you put, the less this motor runs. And ACBs and complicatedness, because the more ACBs we add to set up a gate where if enemy is present and batteries are below 20%, let the batteries go down to 20%, turn on generator, and then you have to do one again for 2 more for the charge rate, and then you'd have to do 1 to turn it off. I think you could still leave 1 to turn it off universally. If batteries hit 99% turn off, yeah, you could do it. So you just need 2 more. If the enemy is present, let it go down to 20. If enemy is not present, if enemy is present and batteries are 80%, turn it on, and then if enemy is present and battery below 80%, turn on the charge rate. So you need 5 ACBs, and that just opens you up to a little bit more of if an ACB fails, then you're screwed. You're actually going, hey, I'm losing battery power. I hear my engine's running. Why ain't I getting battery charge? Run down and go, oh, the ACB is broken. Run over to the engine blocks that turn your charge rate on, and then bring them up to it opens you up to another more failure points, and using 5 ACBs over just 3. And so I usually like to put my ACBs around my engine blocks and then armor the whole section up to where if the ACB gets destroyed, it usually is gotten through the armor where the engine's destroyed. And if you don't have an engine, there's no point in having the ACBs trying to turn them on. So, and then there is a situation where if the ACB the engine block gets destroyed while it's off, and then gets the ACB says turn the engine on, but there's no engine block there. Especially on multi-crank motors like this one, let's say this block gets destroyed and the thing gets below to 80% and it triggers it, and this block isn't repaired yet, only 3/4 of the motor is going to run. You're still going to get charge rate on the 3/4 of the motor, but this one won't turn on because it's not there to be turned on. And the way the ACBs have been acting lately, sometimes they don't re-key back to a part. If they trigger when a part isn't there, they don't re-trigger. See how it says controlling 4 blocks? I've had them get kicked to where it says only controlling 3 blocks and the part isn't there. And I found the way to fix it is to turn the range down back to 0 and then turn them back up, and they'll reset. I've had that happen to me a few times. And so right now I'm kind of shying away for the new ACBs because of that fact. And so I'm trying to use as minimum amount of them as possible. But that is something that can happen when you start chaining a whole bunch of ACBs together. If ACB gets destroyed, if it doesn't have I think if it doesn't, you don't set the priority, sometimes it can lose its priority. So if you have anything prioritized, you'd want to learn how to use the priority system, because it'll boot some ACBs from the chain sometimes. And if a block that they're controlling gets destroyed in combat, sometimes it won't reattach to that block. And I've had that happen a few times, but that's just a little side note on ACBs. Okay, I hope that shows you guys that big power per fuel number motors are stupid. About time you get past the 5, 6, 7,000, 8,000 power per fuel numbers. This is another example over here. 7,052 power per fuel uses 0 fuel to make 2,400 horsepower in a 5x8x12 binding box. That is a huge motor for 2400 horsepower for a zero fuel motor. That's, you know, sure, you could have one fuel tank to run that, and you could basically do the entire campaign with one fuel tank. If you put one fuel tank somewhere inside the motor and armor it up to where it never gets destroyed, you can run an entire campaign with no fuel for 2400 horsepower. But is that the better way to go? I would say no. You're probably better off with a hypercube and a 5x5x5 binding box that uses 1.9 fuel with a couple, say, put another layer, say a whole layer of 5x5 fuel tanks, which would give you 25,000 fuel, I think. Yeah, 25,000 fuel. And you could still run most of the campaign on that and save space for a backup, a 2400 backup electric system. Or you could use the hypercube and put, you know, 2400, well, let's see, 25 blocks minus 3 would be 2200 fuel with 3 ACBs, or you could still do 2500, but you still would be in less space with say 2500 or 2400 fuel, 3 ACBs, electric motor, and batteries to back it all up. You'd still be in less space than this big motor right here. Or you have the option to, say, run a hypercube as your combat motor for 2400, which is what your motor what your craft needs, and then, say, run like a 3T as a cruise motor. And all you would do is set this up as like an electric generator. You would set it up to if enemy is present, turn on the motor. If enemy is not present, turn off the motor. And then just make sure your 3T cruise motor is outside of the range of those ACBs. And you could use the 3T's fuel efficiency at a 400% load to, you know, drive your ship on cruise. And then when an enemy is present, this motor would turn on, and then, you know, say half a second later, your shields would turn on. ACBs would turn your shields on. That's another option where you don't need batteries and you don't need electric. Or you can go battery, backup, electric, which I've showed right here, by choosing a more dense motor that's slightly less efficient in the bottom end and circumventing that with a full electric backup system. And I hope that shows you guys that ultra efficient motors, although I do like them, they are kind of stupid. I've been able to get zero fuel motors that do 10,677 power per fuel, use zero fuel with only 24 exhaust gases at 800 horsepower in a 5x5x6 area. But anything over that is stupid. It's just you know, my dad could beat up your dad. I got more internet points than you. It doesn't make any sense. And once you get to a certain size, over exhausting a motor to get that small difference in fuel economy from 1029 to like 770 on that motor, over exhausting is not a good way to go. If it makes your motor bigger, and that electric turning your motors into generators is way more efficient, because I really didn't do the calculations on how long this motor runs that 480 load continuously, how long the generator stays off versus, say, turning the ultra efficient one on and running a 480 load continuously, you know, on fuel. I mean, it's a 50% savings in fuel by running this motor over that motor, but that motor runs for 3 seconds. So, yeah, the time that it would take, you'd have to do a lot of calculations, and I don't feel that it's worth it. I think the point has been proved, and I'll see you guys in the next one.